Joe talks about Joe. And now, your host, Joe Slepsky.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to Joe on Joe. It's me, your host, Joe Slepsky, and we are back this week for a different type of episode. It is Joe on Joe Illustrated. We are covering comic books, but technically what we're doing today is not illustrated at all. We are talking about a prose piece. In fact, I hope you like these dulcet tones, because I'm going to be treating you all to a reading of a G.I. Joe short story that was published in a book that probably not of you have ever read before. So that's very exciting. If you saw the artwork for this, you know what it is. But if not, I'm going to wait and tease you out until we get to the rest of the show. So welcome back aboard, everybody. And thank you, listeners. Welcome back to all of you and all you newcomers. This is the podcast where I break down everything G.I. Joe, like old school stuff. We talked about the cartoons. We've talked about the comic books. We did the movie. We did G.I. Columbo. We did Destro, Frost Destro. We did Cold Slither behind the music. All kinds of good stuff here on Joe on Joe. We've done a lot over the last 8 years. And I love it. I love hearing from you guys, man. Just this week, I got great emails from, was it Bradley and Bobby? You reached out, and Rich B sent me a nice note. I'm serious. I love hearing from you listeners. It gives me life. It gives me, that joie de vivre, so to speak, to keep going on. And it's really nice to hear from you, because I love hearing, not just because it's always nice to hear someone say, hey, I like your stuff, or whatever, or I listen. Not even I like you. I'll just take a listen. I got to be honest. But just feedback, You guys know I do the show solo. I love guesting on other shows, but this is a solo jam. So it is great when I hear from you. And the note that I got from Rich B is actually what prompted me to think about this today. Rich, you gave a great suggestion. I did get back to you on email or on over Instagram. So we are going to cover those. I won't say what that was. But it got me thinking out of the box a little bit. And what could we do? So before we talk about what we're doing today, I want you to go online and I want you to say hello on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Joe on Joe Pod. You can send me an email to joeandjoepod@gmail.com. If you're inclined, visit our Patreon page. Help keep the show going, patreon.com/JoeOnJoePod. And while you're doing all that, you feel free to rate and review this program. And you can also give a follow to our wonderful sponsors, the Movies in a Meal podcast. In the beginning of time, the smallest organism gained sentience and thought to itself, I really need a good meal. Then a bunch of other stuff happened, and finally the Lumiere brothers started showing movies in France. This was all the inspiration that fellow broadcasters Brad, Keith, and Ben needed to combine these two primal needs into the Movies in a Meal podcast. The Movies in a Meal is one of the most casual and relaxing film talk podcasts you could ever listen to. These three friends enjoy a good meal together while talking all about the movies. And not just reviews, they do favorite lists, comparison discussions, genre talks, anything and everything that you can think of. They've even broken their solemn promise inherent in the name and branched out into TV talk. So I love the variety of films they bring to the table. They cover new releases, classics, cult films, often in one episode. It's really a delight to listen to, and it has something for every movie fan out there to enjoy. So if you're looking to grow your podcast library, if you eat meals, and if you've ever seen a movie, then you should give Ben, Keith, and Brad a listen and subscribe to the Movies in a Meal podcast. They've been a great sponsor to this show. I love the Movies in a Meal podcast, and I'd like all of you to love them too. We're talking about Action Force today, but specifically, we're talking about Action Force annuals. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, an expert in Action Force. However, I do know some of the broad strokes. So I'm going to get some details wrong. I know some of you listeners are super Action Force fans, but there are a lot of you out there that don't really understand what it is. So I'm going to broad stroke it. Basically, G.I. Joe existed. It was an American product. It was awesome. Over in England, a company called Palatoys was like, hey, we want to do G.I. Joe. That's pretty cool. But G.I. Joe was pretty American. So Palatoys put out a thing called Action Force. And I believe originally it was technically Battle Action Force. We're going to get to that in one quick second. And it was Action Force through right around 1986. And it was very similar G.I. Joe characters. A lot of them actually were the same. There were a lot that were the same character with different names. And eventually they started publishing a weekly comic book called Action Force. Now in Britain, I do know this from just regular comic book stuff, they did a lot of weekly comics, whereas Marvel would put out comic books in general. Over here would be monthly books, right? Captain Britain from Marvel was published weekly. One other book, I think that appeared in the back of, I think, their Hulk book. There was a book that they put out, a book called Superpowers, or Superheroes rather, and that was like Spider-Man in the lead with, I think for a while, Captain Britain. He was a backup in a lot of that stuff. But but they would mash and reprint a lot of American comic books under those names, and they'd be weekly books. So sometimes they would only be half of the actual American comic book, or like an eighth, or like a third of the comic book, things like that. I'm broad stroking all of this, so lots of little details. Please don't hate me if you're a historian and hearing this. Please don't rip your hair out. I'm bald already. But that's kind of the way that the British comic scene evolved. They had a lot of their own big successes. Warrior Magazine, 2000 AD, things like that. And they were all in this like weekly format. It's just a different market than the American comics were. So along comes G.I. Joe, and they start putting out Action Force. And Action Force, the comic book, was reworked G.I. Joe issues with some slipped in, fresh original English material. You can find the Action Force run. Marvel published them all under the Marvel UK banner. You can find them as Action Force, but then also in America, Marvel published something called European Missions, which was reprints of some of the Action Force stuff. So it's kind of a long, convoluted history. And in fact, there is a Kickstarter book that came out I think it kickstarted last year. And you can currently buy it just straight. It's no longer Kickstarter, obviously, but you can just buy it straight from the website. It's called Total Action Force, and it's the history of Battle Action Force. So it's a great product. I actually don't have one on my shelf, but I really kind of want to. And after doing this conversation today, it makes me want to go get it. But that's not what we're not talking about his book, but it's put out by Brian Hickey. It looks great. Everyone I know that has had it has nothing but good things to say. It covers everything, like the actual toys. It's not just the comic books. It's about all that stuff. There were a lot of ideas that were in Action Force and Battle Action Force and all that stuff that have made their way into the main G.I. Joe line over the years. So I think the Red Shadows started there. So Action Force is a cool thing to kind of wrap your head around if you're looking to be like a G.I. Joe completionist, like someone who understands the whole thing. I certainly absolutely have a long way to go before I kind of grasp the whole thing, just because this wasn't stuff that I grew up on. So I'm learning in arrears, so to speak. But Google Total Action Force, the book, and you're going to find this really cool book by Brian Hickey. That's going to give you a lot of the history on it. You could also go to, like yojo.com, the Joepedia. They have a pretty good write-up of it, kind of a, broad stroke history of it, like the toys, when they expanded, they kind of just became G.I. Joe proper around like 1988, 89, so on and so forth. So like on their Joepedia page, it listed a bunch of figures that were renamed, like Tripwire became someone called Blades. Zap became someone named Dolphin, things like that. Gung Ho was renamed Gaucho, which I think is awesome. Snake Eyes, they repainted and called him Stalker, which I think is pretty neat. And they did the toys too, etc., so on and so forth. Anyway, that's your own research project, kids, and maybe we'll do a deeper dive in there. But what I have in my hands here, and this is some stuff that's been on my shelf for a little while because it's always been on my radar. I have quite a few issues of Action Force, the weekly. I have all the European Mission comic books and all that stuff. But I also have these Action Force annuals. Now, in Britain, they would put out these annuals. Now, they're similar to what a Marvel annual is, where once a year, hence the name annual, there would be big stories. Right? You guys know G.I. Joe yearbooks and things like that. It's funny that the Action Force is called an annual. All the other Marvel comics had annuals, but G.I. Joe in America called it a yearbook. Anyway, they'd usually have like one big story that wraps it up and everything. In this case, what Action Force annuals did, and I have an X-Men annual. There were a few other books that put out these annuals. They're hardcover, and they're larger format. They're more like shelf books. Size-wise, the thing that I can closest approximate it to is, do you remember those storybooks, like Star Wars storybook? Where they had like R2D2 and C-3PO on the cover, and it's a glossy hardcover. There's no slipcase, but it's a glossy hardcover cover, and then on the inside, in the Star Wars case, it would be like text and then pictures from the movies and things like that. That's the closest U.S. approximation that I have for these annuals. That's what this annual is like. That's what this X-Men annual I have is like. I've got 3 of the Action Force annuals here now, and inside, what they did is they reprinted a couple issues of the U.S. G.I. Joe, and this one specifically, I'm looking at the first one they put out. It's from 1988. The indicia reads 87, but it's online. Everyone considers it the 1988 annual. So I imagine it was like printed at the tail end of 87 or something like that. And it reprints G.I. Joe number 40 and 41, which is the assault on Cobra Island, or like not the assault on, rather, but the creation of Cobra Island, where they, I guess they assaulted. Yeah, they assaulted in 41, where the massive land rises up in the Gulf and everyone's racing to get on it. So it's more like the birth of Cobra Island, rather, I'd say, than the assault on Cobra Island. But, 2 fabulous issues. And those are reprinted here for the UK audience for, I'm assuming, the first time. But they also have 2 prose pieces in here. And so I thought today we'd read these prose pieces to you guys, because I don't think this is something a lot of you have seen. I certainly haven't seen this anywhere. I'm sure somewhere online they've made copies of it, but I think we're going to do that today. So, So I urge you, go Google Action Force, check it out, learn more, get that book, that Total Action Force book, learn more. You can find a lot of these annuals online too on eBay. I saw most of them for relatively under $20 in that range. The last one, which I believe is 1992, seems to be the most expensive. At someone was selling it for under $50. It doesn't mean it's been sold at under $50, but that's a lot of times the last of a series like this. It has such a small print run that it does go up in price a lot. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But you can certainly get your hands on these. They're not that hard. So sit back, relax, and we're going to dig into it. All right. So this Action Force annual is the one that features Flint and Footloose on the cover with Destro in the backdrop. And Flint and Footloose are fighting a bunch of Cobra eels in the background. It is the same image on the front and the back. And on the spine, it just says Action Force Annual Marvel. It doesn't have a year listed on the annual itself. Looking ahead, neither does next year's, neither does the year following that. It's when you look on the inside, that's when you see the indicia. The first 2 pages are some great. It's a great 2-page spread of Destro and Flint squaring off at each other. You see that it costs. I think this is pounds. $3.75 pounds. So £3 and 75 pence. Something, is that right? Yeah, whatever it would have been at the day. Then we've got a table of contents. So Action Force, recruited from the very best of the world's military. Action Force's task is to fight evil and defend human freedom against the terrorist activities of Cobra, a secret army of anti-establishment criminal subversives. And then it talks about Cobra Island, which is actually G.I. Joe, Real American Hero number 40. And then the next story is going to be what we're going to read today, which is Night Fighting. And then Cobra Island Part 2, which is G.I. Joe number 41. Now, Night Fighting, just to give you a brief overview, it says, with operations in the States reaching fever pitch, this is a 2-part strip story. You'd expect Action Force's European division to be what does this say? To be on the first Hercules out to Mexico. So why do we find them standing calmly listening to a lecture in the Simcom room? And what are the circumstances that lead Flint and Footloose into battle against a platoon of Cobra Sea commandos on dry land? What? Key Action Force personnel are Flint, Footloose, and Lady J. Mission Control. Welcome to the first ever action-packed Action Force Annual for Marvel Comics. Those of you who have been following Marvel's Action Force comic every week will know the sort of thrills and spills to expect in this blockbuster 64-page volume. And those of you who haven't come across Marvel's brand of Action Force adventure and excitement before can be assured that you are in for a treat. Apart from a 43-page story that tells of the battle for Cobra Island, we're also presenting you a titanic two-part story that features Flint and Destro in a bitter struggle for survival called Night Fighting. Be sure not to miss this one, as it could have dire consequences for all the members of Action Force's European unit, and it's lavishly illustrated by a regular Action Force artist, Kev Hopgood. And with that, there's just a few illustrations that go with them, mostly prose here. This annual is a gift that no Action Force enthusiast can afford to be without, so be sure to individualize your copy by writing your name in the space below. That way everyone will know that it's your own personal property, and this Action Force book belonged to none other than the Monkey's own David Jones. That's not true. None other than David Bowie. No, but it is a kid named David Jones. And his name was Black Scout, his code name. They give you room for a code name. He did not fill in a rank, and he did not paste his own photo, which they also give you room for. So I'm assuming David Jones was a young British kid. God bless you if you're out there, David. We literally have your copy of Action Force Annual 88. It's awesome. Thank you for sharing it with the world. So I hope somehow this finds David Jones. It does not say like David Jones from, Manchester or anything like that. So David Jones seems as John Smith as you get in the British naming community. But if this happens to reach around the world and anyone in England who knows a David Jones that would have been way into G.I. Joe back in the day, enough to write his name in the book, we've got his copy. And you know what? I'm happy to send it to him. If David Jones reaches out to me and we, confirm that it's him, yeah, I'll send it to you. Absolutely. Sure. We'll get you your book back. I think that's hilarious. So, all right. Anyway, so they do a full-on reprint, and it looks great. It's just absolutely a full-on reprint of 40. Rod Wiggum, it's like, that first appearance of Shipwreck and all that stuff. And they're battling in the Gulf, things like that. And it's got Candy Apple in it. The G.I. Joe tactical battle platforms all get chewed up and all that stuff. So we'll set that aside for now, because that's not really why we're here, folks. We're here for Night Fighting, Part 1. Now, these Kev Hopgood drawings are great. He did looks like he did the cover, which is reprinted on this page. And then he did some illustrations, mostly of Flint and Footloose. And they're in like a medical facility. Very, just some static photos. And then at the end, there's a nice surprise, which we won't get into. But, here we go. We're going to read it now. Night Fighting Part 1. Story by Steve Allen, A-L-A-N. Illustrations by Kev Hopgood. Color with a U by Steve White. So it starts with some descriptions. Flint, heart, 45 beats per minute. Blood pressure, 120/70. Respiration, 40 per minute. Time, 8:42 p.m. Time to move. 20 minutes west of the parachute drop with daylight fading, Warrant Officer Flint and infantry trooper Footloose of Action Force were facing off against the massed hordes of Cobra. Flint was unhappy. Eels! What in the hell's... Ooh, they really said there. What in the hell's name is a platoon of Cobra Sea Troopers doing way out here? The gathering dusk was illuminated for a moment by a distant explosion, revealing a war-torn landscape. Nearby was a shallow, mud-clotted ditch. Dig in, roared Flint above the clatter of gunfire as he and Footloose leapt to dodge a searing hail of bullets. Where are we, Footloose? Flint grimaced as cool mud soaked his battle fatigues. There was no reply from his comrade, who stared fixedly ahead, eyes glassy in the twilight. Flint returned his gaze to the scene before them, to the rolling black clouds, the sporadic explosions, and the seething waves of faceless adversaries, like his every darkest nightmare given breath. Bum, bum, bum. Night Fighting Part 1. How sleep the brave, gentlemen? In the underground seclusion of Action Force's London headquarters, a tall bearded man in early middle age gestured theatrically to the main screen of the simulated combat room. On it was the electronic image of another man, who wore a cumbersome golden helmet bedecked with wires and circuitry. With the advent of Project Morpheus, we are an important step closer to the answer. Hating himself, Raymond Trent stifled a yawn. Perhaps it was all talk of sleep, or perhaps, as his wife frequently reminded him, he had been overworking. More likely it was Norval himself, Dr. Laszlo Norval, and his hellish lecture, now running for a second thrilling hour. Ladies and gents, sleeping bags available in the foyer. Still, smuggling Europe's foremost name in neurological research into Britain unnoticed had been no small feat of international protocol. Even for the director of the Ministry of Defense, Trent supposed the least he could do was to sit through Norval's blasted sermon without nodding off. Around him, Flint, Footloose, and Lady J studied the screen with every indication of rapt attention as Norval continued. Bear with me but a few moments more, and all will be explained to your satisfaction. He glanced pointedly in Trent's direction. Morpheus, simply put, is the ultimate in simulated combat. While the subject sleeps, actual combat scenarios are programmed into the simulation matrix. The headset synthesizes these into digital impulses, which the sleeping mind, in dream state, interprets as reality. So what you're saying, basically, is you can control our dreams? Flint cut in. Trent glanced at him approvingly. He himself had become hopelessly lost somewhere around, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." In simplistic terms, those are essentially the facts, replied Norval loftily. But your average full-blown scrap is a wee bit livelier than an afternoon snooze, joined Footloose. What's to stop us from waking up when the going gets nasty? Norval sighed heavily. Gentlemen, please. As I was about to explain, the subject is rendered susceptible to the Morpheus device through controlled doses of Nembucane, a powerful hallucinogen of my own devising. A drug? Asked Lady J. Laboratory tested, and with no measurable side effects. A drug, yes. Norval was becoming prickly. The subject's life signs and stress responses are then monitored on an oscillograph. He favored Lady J with a cheeky smile, or, indeed, her combat aptitude and psychological profile graphed against the optimum. In its crudest terms, Norval continued sharply, as Flint made to speak, the Morpheus program puts you through the hoop, much as your SimCom room does. Where Morpheus makes SimCom obsolete is that I require no external hardware to do so. The floor is yours, Mr. Trent. Trent's head snapped up sharply as he desperately refocused. All eyes were upon him, and he realized with horror that he had been sleeping soundly for some minutes. So if I understand correctly, Dr. Norval, he said thickly, the Morpheus program controls our dreams. I have already answered that question, Mr. Trent. Not to my satisfaction. With one exception, everybody laughed. Flint, heart rate, 58 beats per minute. Blood pressure, 140/84. Respiration, 60 per minute. Time, 9:09 p.m. Where are they all coming from, Footloose? Flint's Winchester skived down the advancing ranks of Cobra frogmen, yet still they marched, relentless. Indefatigable. That is the word I've seen printed so many times, I hate pronouncing it. Indefatigable. Pronounce it. I don't know. Stepping doggedly over the bodies of their fallen comrades. It's like being a part of some damned amusement arcade. Your guess is as good as mine, replied Footloose in something like his familiar conversational tone. But when Flint turned to look at him, his face might have been carved in marble. That the man beside him was Footloose was undeniable. Yet something about him rang a discordant note. This Footloose was a pale specter of his old friend. You okay? He yelled above the ratchet. The din of submachine gun fire. But Footloose's answering smile did not so much as touch the glacial wasteland of his eyes. Before them, like some great bacterial cell, the platoon of eels was dividing into two. Flint continued to watch an imposing black-clad figure strode to the head of the platoon. Even at such a distance, the languorous physical power of the man, the aura of sheer, undiluted evil he generated, were impossible to ignore. Flint felt himself paralyzed, his muscles waxen and dead, as Destro slowly hoisted a piece of heavy artillery to shoulder height. He was unable even to blink as the pleasing warmth of the rifle's laser sighting targeted the very center of his forehead. A sharp peak sent the circuits of the oscillograph clittering as Flint's muscles locked into rigidity on the Simcom couch. His breath came in shallow gasps, his skin sheened with sweat. Both Footloose and Lady J cast worried glances at Laszlo Norval, but the neurologist wore only the sunniest of smiles. "Ah," he said softly, "the pains of sleep." "I think you'll have to be rather more specific than that, Dr. Norval," said Trent coldly. "Please indulge me. A moment longer, Mr. Trent." Norval turned a small portable keyboard to face his audience. "It is now precisely 34 minutes since I administered 2 cc's of Nembucane. Warrant Officer Flint is quite comatose. The Morpheus matrix, contained in the headgear he is now wearing, has attuned itself to the sine curve of his sleeping mind, rendering him eminently suggestible to external stimuli." You've hypnotized him," Footloose finished, impatiently. Yeah." Flint struggled weakly on the couch, lips working soundlessly as the electronic blip of the oscillograph galloped, slowed, galloped again. "What's he seeing?" Leaning over the couch, Lady J watched, fascinated, as Flint's eyes flickered wildly behind his closed lids. "The scenario reads simply, Battle Zone," explained Norval. "The actual location will be fleshed out by Flint's memory using either a place he has been before or an amalgam of several such places. Against this backdrop, I have programmed a platoon of Cobra Eels, a relatively standard combat maneuver, I fancy." "And what do you fancy to these readings, Laddybuck?" Footloose stabbed an angry finger. Of all the people saying Laddybuck, first of all, me. Second of all, Footloose. Stabbed an angry finger at the wildly fluctuating oscillograph as Flint's heart rate continued to flutter erratically. "It doesn't look like they're playing a kiss catch." Flint's heart is now 100 beats per minute. Blood pressure 150/90. His respiration is 90 per minute, and the time is 9:48 p.m. "Dive!" Footloose smashed bodily into Flint as they both cannoned sideways, the back wall of their dugout disintegrating in a smothering rain of mud and gravel. Half buried, the acrid odor of burning hair reached Flint's nostrils as another crimson bolt from Destro's blaster stung the knight, scant millimeters from his face. "Plasma, phase rifle, 40-watt range," he said, half to himself. "Thanks, Footloose." "Anytime." There was no change of expression on Footloose's features as he spoke, but now Flint was occupied with more pressing concerns, not the least of which was remaining alive. He cursed as he retrieved his Winchester, now thickly encrusted with mud. Fumbling for his belt in the clinging ooze, he unclipped a hand grenade. "Here's where we keep the Destro family GP in steady employment," he muttered, grinning mirthlessly as he loosed the grenade squarely into the path of the oncoming cobras. An orange flower blossomed and died in the night to a discordant choir of screams. Some of the cobra crumpled, a ghost-like mound in the middle distance. Others melted surreally into the smoke, but there, lying perfectly still in the center of the carnage, was an unmistakable silver-domed form. "I don't believe it," gasped Flint, hardly aware of his own incredulous laughter. "I killed Destro." Cautiously, they crawled clear of the ditch, advancing stooped and cat-like on the fallen eels, but nothing moved in the stillness as they approached Destro's body. "It's time to go, Flint," said Footloose. "There's nothing more for us here." But when Flint turned, his companion's eyes were dead as those of Destro, staring sightlessly from the gleaming carapace of his battle mask. "No," said Flint, "not yet." A great sense of destiny gripped Flint as he stooped over the corpse, lying broken and immobile like a discarded mannequin. Since the time of the Crusades, whenever the bloody specter of war bestrode the land, history had documented the involvement of the Destro line. Theirs was a lineage of dark legend, a dynasty built on misery and death, yet, in all this time, none had ever lived to speak of the men beneath the ceremonial silver mask. In 700 years, the Destros had remained as faceless as the Grim Reaper himself. Flint was prepared for a great many things as he snapped open the silver visor, but when he saw the dead face, his scream was that of a man trapped in an eternal hell from which there was no escape. An anguished cry escaped Flint, his body convulsing on the Simcom couch. Trent was attempting to flick a small sugared mint from its plastic container, a skill he had never mastered, and did not welcome the intrusion, nor did he care for the oscillograph's readings. Peeking jaggedly into the red, he said as much. "One does not make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, Mr. Trent," clucked Laszlo Norval. "To all intents and purposes, Officer Flint is in a life-threatening situation, yet his response is by far the most impressive of any subject I've tested to date." For all we know, your other subjects took out a party booking in a rubber barricade, spat Footloose. And what if Cobra wins? Added Lady J. I mean, what if he dies? Sleep and death are such close companions, don't you think? Replied Laszlo Norval, smiling pleasantly. Flint's heart rate at this point is 130 beats per minute. His blood pressure is 165 over 100. Respiration 110 per minute. Time is 10:14 p.m. The racket and clangor of helicopter blades pursued Flint and Footloose as they charged headlong across the darkened plain, pinioned now and then by interweaving searchlights. Fangs, Flint thought grimly, fully armed, negator, gyrocopters, Cobra hardware, each equipped with 20mm grenade launcher, each capable of 175 miles an hour. Flint and Footloose were traveling considerably slower. Noise hammered and beat at Flint through every muscle in his frantically pumping body, the fierce wind of threshing rotor blades tearing at their backs, the fine needles of tracer bullets stitched ugly tracks in the landscape, and it was clear to Flint that the pilots of the Fangs, at least 7 at last count, were merely toying with them. It is useless to run. Please remain where you are and lay down your weapons. Silver fingers tightened to a fist around Flint's pounding heart. The voice was unmistakably that of Destro, but it couldn't be. Destro lay dead in a shallow ditch, a victim of his own savage ways. I repeat, it is useless to run. Surrender now or you will be killed, without compunction. Both Flint and Footloose tripped, the air whirling, buffeting around them as they fell. Something unyielding metallic connected with Flint's jaw. As his vision cleared, he saw that it was one of the tracks of a disused railway siding, and rearing darkly ahead, in the gloom, was an ancient rotting maw of an old railway tunnel. To Flint, it might have been the gates of heaven. He and Footloose launched themselves towards it, zigzagging wildly to dodge the constant bursts of gunfire. Flint's flagging muscles hauled him at last into the cool sanctuary of the tunnel. Footloose only yards behind, and both men collapsed, panting raggedly. Outside, the Fangs hovered, clattering angrily. Flint's breathing gradually regulated as he flipped open his breast pocket, producing a small walkie-talkie. 2 may be company, Footloose, old son, but 7 Fangs in a crowd, I can live without. Pip, old bean. I added that part. About time we had a little air support, I think. Footloose, an indistinct form in the gloom of the tunnel, did not reply, but this was no longer a source of surprise to Flint. For a moment, the radio was dead, an unresponsive slug of plastic in his fist. Then the LED display flickered into life, pulsing rhythmically as suddenly tinny strains of music issued from the speaker. Take a cup and a half of sunbeams, a disembodied voice squawked. Pour them into a deep blue sky. Flint's mouth hung, slack and horrified, as the music spilled chirpily into the night air. It was an old 1930s dance number, a favorite of his father's. Add a couple of drops of love dreams and make yourself a happiness pie. The walkie-talkie fell from Flint's slack fingers, as a man might drop a poisonous reptile. I always hated that song, he said helplessly. Maybe the walls of the tunnel are jamming the signal, offered Footloose. His voice as flat and unreadable as his dim silhouette in the pitch darkness. A rational fear clawed at Flint as he turned to face the other man. It seems we've a few unanswered questions, doesn't it? He said. Why were we attacked by Cobra Frogmen when we're apparently miles from any body of water? Why was Destro, an arms dealer who presumably turns a tidy profit without dirtying the family silverware in a single combat, leading the platoon? And assuming he's now one of the deadest people I've seen in some time, who's piloting the lead chopper out there? These questions bother me, Footloose. They bother me quite a bit. Footloose did not reply. Another thing, Footloose, can you remember how we even got here? Do you even know where we are? Silence. But I'll tell you the one thing that really worries me. Action Force Communications hardware is the best of its kind in the Western world. It takes a licking, but it keeps on ticking. It doesn't play lousy 1930s dance music, and it takes more than an empty railway tunnel to jam transmissions. I know it, and you know it too. Without warning, Footloose spun on his feet, walking quickly and purposely to the mouth of the tunnel, directly into the path of the waiting Fangs. Flint bellowed a warning, but it was already far too late. He watched as Footloose hung suspended in midair, jerking like a marionette as the combined gunfire of 7 Fangs smashed into his limp body. What? There was never so much a chance. Footloose was dead before he hit the ground. That's hardcore, everybody. I know we all know it's just a simulation, but that's Worlds Without End level hardcoreness. Flint felt his legs move beneath him, blind instinct rather than logical thought spurring him to the aid of his friend. He caught Footloose as he sank lifelessly to the ground, and just before his eyes rolled sightlessly into his head, it seemed that a glimmer of the old Footloose returned for a fleeting moment. But then the moment was past, and the only broken husk of infantry trooper Andrew McKay remained. Flint's face froze, expressionless, as he turned to face the fangs. Destro was now clearly visible as the pilot of the lead copter, his silver mask a glimmering, grinning death's head as it bobbed in the darkness. "I'm gonna kill you," said Flint softly. "I don't like it," snapped Trent. "Bring him out now." On the Simcom couch, Flint writhed and thrashed, crying out in anguish as the oscillograph raged and clattered, overheated servo motors whining. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Mr. Trent. The Morpheus program. I don't give a single solitary damn about the Morpheus program. You're killing my best man. Bring him out of it now, or so help me, I'll see you struck off." Laszlo Norval's self-satisfied smile had become a smirk as he picked absently at a blister on the back of his hand. "Warrant Officer Flint cannot be revived whilst under the effects of Nembucane. Any attempt to wake him could result in an irreversible trauma, even death." Trent, Footloose, and Lady J watched, transfixed with horror, as Norval tore the living flesh from his hands, discarding it like perished gloves. Beneath the surface, there was no blood, only gleaming black leather. "Similarly, any attempts to counter the effects of Nembucane with drugs of your own would prove quite fatal." Raising his hands to his forehead, Norval plunged his fingers deep into his own face. "Regrettably, Flint's only option is to ride the Morpheus program through to completion, which will likely kill him anyway, of course." With a final sharp tug, Laszlo Norval's entire face came away in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe we have been formally introduced. My name is Destro." The spirit of evil peered from beneath a silver mask. Bam continued next week on Joe on Joe. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I'm telling you, some of that, it's English, but it's English. And the syntax is just off enough to make me, make these very nearsighted eyes go, "What did I just read?" So I hope you guys enjoyed that. Join us next week where we're going to finish off part 2 of, what was it called? Night Action? Something like that. Destro Strikes. Night Fighting. Will Flint. Also, I love that. It's just like this alternate universe of G.I. Joe. That's what's always fascinated me about Action Force. It's this alternate universe of G.I. Joe. Everything's the same, but it's just a little different. Like I was saying, Lady J, they only spell it with the letter J. They don't spell J-A-Y-E. It's just Lady J. So that was fascinating. Just hearing Footloose speak in proper British, like English, when over here he was the stoned out, stoner hippie dude. Absolutely brilliant. I love it. This was a lot of fun. So please join me next week for part 2. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. And we'll see you next week. Now you Joe and Joeing, Sam the Battle.